Stop. Before the battles, before the declarations, before Valley Forge and Yorktown and the marble statues. There is one moment you need to understand. 1763. Britain has just won the 7 Years' War, the most expensive, most brutal global conflict the world had ever seen. France is crippled. Spain is weakened. The Atlantic is, for all practical purposes, a British lake. No empire in living memory has stood this tall. Now hold that image. Within 20 years, that same empire will be forced to sit across a table and legally hand over a third of North America to a group of farmers, merchants, and militia who, not so long ago, called themselves loyal British subjects. Not because Britain ran out of soldiers, not because its navy failed, because it made one decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. A decision about money. And that decision lit a fire that Britain had absolutely no idea how to put out. This is not the revolution you were taught in school. This is what actually happened. The 13 colonies were not one place. From the granite coast of Massachusetts down to the tobacco fields of Georgia, they were 13 separate worlds, 13 separate economies, 13 separate political cultures that had almost nothing in common except one thing. For over a century, Britain had left them alone, not out of generosity, out of practicality. 3,000 miles of ocean made tight control difficult and expensive. So London pursued what historians call salutary neglect. Enforce the big things, trade laws, allegiance to the crown, and let the colonies govern themselves day to day. It worked. The colonies prospered. They stayed loyal. They paid their dues. But here is what Britain failed to see. All those decades of self-governance had changed the colonists in ways that could not be undone. The colonial assemblies had grown muscle, real power. The men who sat in those chambers had spent generations making laws, levying local taxes, debating and arguing and governing. They thought of themselves as Englishmen, and they meant it. They believed, with complete sincerity, in the ancient English principle that a man could not be taxed by a government in which he had no voice. That was not radical ideology. That was the oldest constitutional tradition in British political history. Britain had spent 100 years teaching these men to think like free people. In 1763, it decided to teach them something else. It would learn, very quickly, that lesson was not reversible. 1763. The war is over. Britain has won. Then the accountants arrive. The 7 Years' War cost approximately £130 million. The entire annual revenue of the British government at that moment, roughly £8 million. The national debt has nearly doubled. Interest payments alone are consuming more than half of everything Parliament brings in. Someone has to pay. The ministers in London study the map. They see the 13 colonies, prospering, growing, protected by British troops stationed along the new frontier. The logic to them is airtight. The colonists benefit from that protection. They should help pay for it. Not much, just a fair share. This is the moment the British Empire makes its fatal error. Not because the logic is wrong, because the politics is catastrophically miscalculated. 1764, the Sugar Act. Customs duties on molasses from non-British islands. The colonists grumble. 1765. The Stamp Act, a direct tax on every piece of printed material in the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, all of it taxed. The colonists don't grumble. They explode. Because the Sugar Act was a trade regulation. Annoying, but familiar. The Stamp Act was something different in kind. It was Parliament, a body in which no colonist held a single seat, directly taxing the internal life of the colonies. No vote, no voice, no representation. 4 words emerge from the fury. No taxation without representation. Not a slogan, not radical ideology, a constitutional claim. A statement of what the colonists believed were their fundamental rights as British subjects, rights as old and as English as Parliament itself. By October 1765, 27 delegates from 9 colonies have gathered in New York for the Stamp Act Congress. They argue, they disagree, they represent deeply different interests. And then something happens that has never happened before. They agree together. Multiple colonies speaking with one voice. Britain feels the pressure. In 1766, it repeals the Stamp Act. The colonists celebrate what looks like victory. It is not victory. On the exact same day, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act. It passes the Declaratory Act. Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies extends to all cases whatsoever. Britain blinked, but it did not yield. Both sides understood exactly what that meant, and neither side would forget it. History does not happen on its own. It happens because specific people, at specific moments, make decisions that cut one way instead of another. Samuel Adams was the revolution before the revolution had a name. Boston politician, failed businessman, master of political anger. Adams understood, earlier, more clearly, more completely than anyone, that reconciliation with Britain was not merely difficult, it was impossible. And while moderate men were still writing petitions and hoping London would listen, Adams was building the infrastructure of resistance. The committees of correspondence, a network connecting colonial activists across thousands of miles, turning local grievances into a coordinated political movement. He knew how to take an incident and make it a cause. He knew how to manufacture outrage at precisely the moment outrage was needed. He was, depending on your perspective, a patriot of fierce principle, or a dangerous agitator who pushed people toward a war they hadn't fully chosen. Perhaps the answer is both. In 1770, British soldiers fire into a crowd in Boston, killing 5. Adams calls it a massacre. Paul Revere engraves an image, British regulars firing in cold formation at helpless civilians. The reality is more complicated. The soldiers were being pelted with ice and rocks, and were largely acquitted at trial. But historical accuracy was not Adams's concern. Political emotion was. And at political emotion, Adams had no equal. George Washington was a different instrument entirely. Virginia planter, French and Indian war veteran, a man of enormous personal dignity and, beneath that surface, a temper he spent a lifetime controlling. Washington was not a natural revolutionary. He was conservative, almost by definition. He believed in order, property, hierarchy, the proper arrangement of things. What made him a revolutionary was the slow, grinding conviction that Britain had forfeited its right to command his loyalty. He was not a brilliant tactical general. He would lose more battles than he won. What he possessed was something rarer. He could absorb catastrophe, watch his army shattered, watch men desert, watch the cause seem to collapse, and hold. Men stayed because Washington stayed, and as long as Washington stayed, the revolution was not dead. Benjamin Franklin was 70 years old when he crossed the Atlantic to Paris. The most famous American in the world, scientist, philosopher, diplomat, the man who pulled lightning from the sky, had spent years in London trying to find a peaceful resolution to the imperial crisis. He came home certain that no such resolution existed. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was 70 years old. Then he crossed the ocean again. Because there was one thing the revolution needed more desperately than soldiers or gunpowder. It needed a friend powerful enough to matter. And there was only one candidate. France. These men were not saints. Washington owned enslaved people. Franklin had backed British imperial policy until it suited him not to. Adams was a manipulator of the First Order. But they were exactly what the moment required. And the moment was about to arrive. December 16th, 1773. Boston Harbor. Just after dark. Parliament has passed the Tea Act, giving the British East India Company a monopoly on colonial tea sales. The price of tea technically drops, but the tax remains. Parliament's tax. And if the colonists drink the tea, they are accepting, silently through commerce, the right of a parliament they never elected to tax them. That is the line Adams has been waiting for. That night, a group of men, some organized, some purely spontaneous, dress as Mohawk warriors, board 3 ships anchored in the harbor, and spend the next 3 hours working in near silence. 342 chests, 46 tons of tea. Every chest broken open. Every chest thrown into the harbor. It is vandalism on a spectacular scale, and it is calculated with precision to force a response. Britain responds. Parliament passes what it calls the coercive acts. The colonists call them something else, the intolerable acts. Boston Harbor is closed until the tea is paid for. The Massachusetts government is suspended, its elected assembly dissolved, its powers handed to Crown appointees. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies can be tried in Britain, beyond the reach of colonial juries. Colonists must house British troops. London intends this as a scalpel, surgical punishment of a single rebellious city, a warning to the others. It functions as a torch. The other colonies look at what has been done to Massachusetts and understand, with complete cold clarity, that what happened to Boston can happen to them. Self-governance, which they have possessed so long they assumed it was permanent, can be legislated away. By a parliament they never elected. In a session they never attended. The First Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia, September 1774. 56 delegates, 12 colonies. Most of them are not radicals. They are merchants, lawyers, planters who still believe reconciliation is possible. They send a petition to the king. They organize a boycott. But the act of convening, of speaking collectively, of asserting that the colonies share a cause, is itself the revolution beginning. They are no longer acting like subjects. King George III reads the petition and hears insolence. His ministry begins preparing force. By spring 1775, Boston is occupied by British troops. The militias of the surrounding countryside are quietly stockpiling weapons. The air has that particular quality, heavy, charged, a held breath, of a world that has already decided something and is waiting for someone to say it out loud. On the night of April 18th, General Thomas Gage sends 700 soldiers out of Boston to seize weapons cached at Concord and to arrest Adams and Hancock. Paul Revere rides. At Lexington, at dawn on April 19th, a small militia company stands in the road. Shots are fired. 8 men die. Who fired first is a question that will never be answered. It does not matter. Not anymore. The British march to Concord, find most of the weapons gone, and begin the march back to Boston. For the next 16 miles, they are shot at continuously. Men behind every stone wall, every tree, every rise in the ground. By the time they reach Boston, 73 British dead, nearly 200 wounded. The news moves through the colonies in days, and the question is no longer about taxation. It is whether the colonies and the crown can share the same continent. The smoke at Lexington has given that question its answer. May 1775. The Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. War is already happening. Nobody has declared it. Congress is simultaneously the government of a nation that does not yet legally exist, and a collection of 13 separate political entities that agree on almost nothing. They have no treasury, no army, no constitution, no authority beyond whatever authority the colonies choose to grant them. They create the Continental Army. They appoint Washington to command it, and Washington rides north to find an army that is not an army. It is a mob of militia with expiring enlistments, no uniforms, no common discipline, and enough weapons for perhaps a few pitched battles. At Bunker Hill in June, the Colonials hold their ground against British regulars until they run out of powder, then fall back in reasonable order. Britain takes the hill, at the cost of over 1,000 casualties. The Colonials take something else from that afternoon, the knowledge that British regulars bleed like everyone else. Washington pushes artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga, dragged by sheer brutal effort through the winter wilderness, onto the heights above Boston Harbor. The British look up, realize their position is indefensible, and evacuate the city in March 1776. The Revolution has its first real victory. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's language is extraordinary, a statement of universal human rights, a catalogue of grievances, a formal severance. Its signatories know exactly what they have done. They have committed themselves to independence or to the gallows. Benjamin Franklin is said to have put it plainly: "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Then summer arrives, and Britain responds. 32,000 soldiers, Hessian mercenaries, the Royal Navy. The largest expeditionary force Britain has ever assembled, under General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe, bearing down on New York with a weight of force the Continental Army has no answer for. At Long Island in August, Howe finds Washington's unguarded flank and drives through it. The American left crumbles in hours. Over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Washington escapes across the East River in the night. Boats muffled, thousands of men moved in silence through the fog, and saves his army from total destruction. But New York falls. Then Washington retreats across New Jersey through autumn. The army dissolves as militia terms expire. Men go home. Desertion becomes epidemic. Congress flees Philadelphia. By December, Washington has perhaps 3,000 men fit for duty. Thomas Paine writes in those weeks, "These are the times that try men's souls. They are. The Revolution, 5 months after declaring independence, is on the edge of extinction." This is the moment that defines George Washington. He crosses the Delaware River on Christmas night. 9 miles of broken ice and black water in sleet. 2,400 men. At dawn, he falls on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. 900 captured. American dead. 2 men frozen on the march. None in battle. A week later, he feints toward Cornwallis at Brunswick, slips away in the night, and hits the British rearguard at Princeton before anyone realizes what is happening. Small victories. They change nothing on the map. They change everything in the mind. The Revolution does not die that winter, and because it does not die, Everything that follows remains possible. 1777, Britain makes its move. The plan? General John Burgoyne marches south from Canada through the Lake Champlain corridor with 8,000 men. He is supposed to reach Albany, link up with forces from New York, and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. Split the revolution in two. Kill it at the root. On a map, it is a reasonable plan. The map does not show the wilderness. Burgoyne's army is built for Europe. Open fields, formed ranks, the elegant geometry of 18th century pitched battle. What it finds in upstate New York is dense forest, swampy terrain, and a countryside where every tree conceals a rifle, and every supply wagon is an invitation to ambush. The army covers 20 miles in 20 days. Supplies burn faster than they can be replaced, and then the British plan collapses at the strategic level. General Howe, who is supposed to march north to meet Burgoyne, instead sails his army south to capture Philadelphia, the capital, the seat of the Continental Congress, the political heart of the rebellion. His logic: take Philadelphia and the rebellion loses its nerve. He takes Philadelphia, Congress flees. Washington fights desperate defensive battles at Brandywine and Germantown, and is pushed back, but not broken. But Howe is in Philadelphia, and Burgoyne is in the wilderness, and they are not coming to meet each other. Burgoyne advances on the American position at Saratoga. He is surrounded. The brilliant, brutal Daniel Morgan's riflemen, men who can hit a man-sized target at ranges British muskets cannot match, begin killing Burgoyne's officers one by one. Leadership dissolves. The attack fails. October 17, 1777, John Burgoyne surrenders his entire army, nearly 6,000 men, standards lowered, weapons stacked. In America, Saratoga saves the revolution. In Paris, Saratoga changes the war. Benjamin Franklin has been in Paris since December 1776. He knows something that Washington knows, that every honest man in the Continental Congress knows. The revolution cannot win alone. The Continental dollar is worthless. Congress cannot pay its soldiers. The army bleeds men not to British bullets, but to expired enlistments, starvation, and the cold logic of men who have not been paid and cannot feed their families. Without foreign money, foreign weapons, foreign ships, the arithmetic of this war ends one way. France is the only country that can change the arithmetic, and France has reasons to want to. The 7 Years' War humiliated it. Canada lost. French power in India crippled. Foreign Minister Vergennes has watched the American rebellion with growing interest and growing caution. He wants Britain weakened. He does not want to back a losing side. So Franklin plays a long game. In Paris, he is a phenomenon. The man who pulled lightning from the sky. He wears a fur cap and plays the role of the noble frontier philosopher with absolute mastery. French society adores him. He dines with the aristocracy, charms the salons, and above all, he waits. Saratoga reaches Paris in December 1777. An American army has surrounded and destroyed a British army in open battle. The Americans, against all expectation, can actually win. That is all Vergennes needs to hear. February 1778. France signs a formal treaty of alliance with the United States. It recognizes American independence. It commits ships, soldiers, and money to the fight. The balance of the entire conflict shifts overnight. Britain is no longer suppressing a colonial rebellion. It is fighting France. Spain enters the war in 1779. Dutch financiers begin funneling money to the American cause. The Royal Navy, once supreme, is suddenly stretched across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean. The siege of Gibraltar, which Spain and France pressed through 1779 and beyond, consumes tens of thousands of British troops on a front thousands of miles from American shores. Now consider the irony. France and Spain are absolute monarchies. Vergennes and Louis XVI are not supporting the American Revolution because they believe in republican liberty. The idea of popular sovereignty genuinely alarms them. They are backing America because America is a weapon, a tool to bleed Britain and reclaim lost power. The revolution that declares all men are created equal is being kept alive by the money of kings. Whatever the motive, the effect cannot be denied. Without France, the revolution ends. With France, the revolution becomes winnable, and Britain, which once faced a colonial uprising, now faces a world war it did not want and cannot afford. Here is what the mythology gets wrong. The American Revolution was not a unified people rising against a foreign oppressor. It was a civil war. A savage, intimate, neighbor-against-neighbor conflict embedded inside the larger struggle with Britain. And understanding that changes everything about how you understand the revolution. The Loyalists, Americans who supported the crown, were not a fringe, not a small remnant of the misguided. By most estimates, they constituted 20% of the colonial population, perhaps more. Royal officials, Anglican clergy, wealthy merchants with business ties to Britain, and ordinary people who had no love for revolution and simply feared what it would bring: disorder, debt, the loss of everything familiar. In the South, the fractures ran deep and vicious. Enslaved people understood the war's logic with clarity that cut through every patriotic abstraction. When Britain promised freedom to enslaved people who escaped their patriot masters and joined Crown forces, thousands responded. They were not loyal to the British Empire. They were rational. They were calculating which side offered them a better chance at survival. For native nations, the calculation was equally clear. Many sided with Britain, not from love of the crown, but because they knew exactly what American expansion would mean for their lands. A British victory might slow that expansion. An American victory would accelerate it. Most of them were right. In the Carolina backcountry, the war became something that can only be called atrocity. Communities that had spent years petitioning corrupt colonial courts, their taxes extorted by sheriffs, their land claims stolen by well-connected planters, were now being asked by those same planters to risk everything for a revolution those planters were leading. Many refused. Some joined the Loyalists. Not out of love for Britain, but out of bottomless hatred for the men who claimed to be leading them to liberty. Loyalist and patriot militias burned each other's farms, hanged each other's leaders. The history books remember Bunker Hill. They speak less often of the Waxhaws, where Tarleton's forces killed soldiers who were surrendering, an atrocity that converted the Carolina backcountry to the patriot cause not with ideas, but with pure, personal, unforgettable rage. The revolution was not unanimous, not clean, not inevitable. It survived because enough people believed in it enough, or hated the alternative enough, to keep fighting when every rational calculation said stop. December 1777, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Washington's army staggers into winter camp. 11,000 men. They have no shoes. The supply system has broken down completely. Congress, broke, divided, dysfunctional, cannot provision them. Men leave bloody footprints in the snow. By February, nearly 3,000 men are unfit for duty. 2,500 will die that winter, not from British bullets, from cold, from disease, from the inability of the nation they are fighting for to feed them. This is the revolution at its lowest point. An army starving in Pennsylvania while Congress argues in York. While France has signed an alliance, but its ships have not yet arrived. While Howe's army sits warm and well-fed in Philadelphia, 18 miles away. Several of Washington's own generals are maneuvering behind his back, lobbying Congress to replace him. He does not break. And then, in the cold of that terrible winter, something begins. Friedrich von Steuben arrives, a Prussian officer, former aide to Frederick the Great, with magnificent credentials and almost no English. He walks into Washington's ragged camp and begins to drill, not with contempt, with intensity. He walks the line himself. He demonstrates. He curses spectacularly in French and German when men do it wrong, then laughs and shows them again. He teaches bayonet drill, tactical formations, how to reload under fire, how to march as a unit rather than scatter as a crowd. The army that enters Valley Forge in December and the army that leaves in spring are not the same army. At Monmouth in June 1778, Washington's forces meet the British in open battle. The engagement is tactically inconclusive. But the Americans hold the line. They execute formations. They counterattack. They stand in the field against British regulars and do not break. Something has shifted, and the British feel it. The North is stalemated. Britain shifts south. The southern colonies have larger loyalist populations. They produce the plantation wealth that makes the empire profitable. The plan, pacify the South, establish a loyal base, and use it to strangle the revolution from below. In May 1780, Britain captures Charleston. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrender, the largest American defeat of the entire war. The Southern Continental Army, for practical purposes, ceases to exist. 2 months later at Camden, Cornwallis meets the reconstituted American force under Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, and destroys it. Gates himself flees the battlefield at such speed that, as one historian delicately put it, he did not stop until he had put 60 miles between himself and his catastrophe. South Carolina is under British control. Cornwallis begins planning the march north. He does not yet understand what is gathering behind him. The British strategy has a fatal flaw. Occupying a city is not the same as controlling a countryside. Cornwallis can win pitched battles. He cannot make the farmers and backcountry men of Carolina loyal, and his soldiers, and Tarleton in particular, are making it worse. Burned farms, forced oaths, massacred prisoners. Every atrocity converts more people. At Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780, it comes apart. Over 1,000 backcountry militia, men who fight in the woods on their own terms, with rifles that can kill at ranges British muskets cannot reach, surround and destroy a loyalist force under Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson is killed, his force captured, total. Cornwallis turns back south. He has been stopped. But he is not done. He sends Tarleton, his best cavalry commander, the man who has destroyed every American force he has encountered, to finish off Daniel Morgan's Continental contingent. Daniel Morgan knows Tarleton is coming, and Morgan knows something else. He knows how Tarleton fights. Fast, hard, expecting the militia to break and run, because militia always breaks and runs. That is the single tactical fact on which Tarleton's entire reputation rests. So Morgan builds his battle around it. At Cowpens, January 17, 1781, he places his militia in the front line and tells them explicitly, "Fire 2 volleys, then fall back." Orderly, controlled. Not a rout, a withdrawal to the Continental regulars positioned on the hill behind them. Tarleton attacks. His cavalry swings wide to cut off the expected militia route. The militia fires, dropping over 100 British soldiers in 2 volleys, and walks back to the Continental line in perfect order. Tarleton's cavalry, riding to cut off a retreat, instead rides into the Continental flank. The British line collapses. 900 British soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Tarleton barely escapes on horseback. Cornwallis, when he hears, destroys his own supply wagons to move fast enough to catch Morgan before he can link up with Nathaniel Greene. He never does. Greene leads him across North Carolina on a chase that bleeds his army at every engagement. At Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, Britain holds the field, but loses a quarter of its force in the process. Cornwallis has won the battle. He is losing the South. He has won every battle and is still losing the war. He makes a decision. Cornwallis marches north into Virginia. His reasoning is not unreasonable. Virginia is the strategic center of the American cause. Washington is Virginian. Jefferson is Virginian. The tobacco wealth sustaining the Southern economy is Virginian. Tarleton raids deep into the interior, nearly captures Jefferson at Monticello. The Virginia state government flees. Virginia looks helpless, but helpless is not the same as broken. Cornwallis moves his army back and forth across the state, burning depots, raiding plantations, controlling nothing. He does damage everywhere. He holds nothing anywhere. Finally, on the advice of his superiors in New York, he settles his army at Yorktown, a small tobacco port at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, where the York River meets Chesapeake Bay. He fortifies. He waits for the Royal Navy to resupply him. He does not know what is in motion. In the summer of 1781, Washington receives intelligence that will determine the outcome of the entire war. Admiral François de Grasse, commanding the main French fleet in the Caribbean, is sailing north to the Chesapeake. He will arrive in September. He cannot stay past October. The window is narrow, a matter of weeks. Washington wants to attack New York. Rochambeau persuades him otherwise. If de Grasse closes the Chesapeake, Cornwallis at Yorktown is trapped by sea. Washington's army can close the trap by land. The opportunity is perfect, and it will last exactly as long as that window stays open. Washington makes his move. He feeds false intelligence to the British garrison in New York, convincing them the Franco-American forces are planning an assault on the city. He moves his army south while New York watches its own harbor in confusion. 450 miles, 15 days. He passes through Philadelphia so quickly that Congress barely has time to acknowledge him. September 5th, 1781. Off the Virginia Capes, Admiral de Grasse meets the British fleet under Admiral Graves. The Battle of the Chesapeake is tactically inconclusive. Neither fleet is destroyed. But Graves, battered, withdraws to New York. De Grasse returns to seal the bay. Cornwallis is cut off by sea. 2 weeks later, 17,000 Franco-American troops complete the encirclement by land. 8,000 British soldiers are surrounded on a peninsula with no escape route, no resupply, and no relief coming. The trap is closed. October 6th, 1781. The siege begins. Parallel trenches advance toward the British lines. Artillery fires day and night at relentless pace. British guns reply, but there are more guns on the American side, more powder, more time. Cornwallis watches his perimeter shrink. He sends word to New York. I need relief. I cannot hold long. New York sends word back. Help is coming. Help is not coming in time. 2 fortifications, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10 anchor the British right flank. Without them, the siege lines can be pushed to direct assault range. On the night of October 14th, two columns go forward simultaneously. In silence, bayonets fixed, the French take Redoubt 9. The Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton, who has begged Washington for a combat command for years, take Redoubt 10. Minutes of savage close fighting. Both positions fall. Cornwallis attempts a last move on the night of October 16th. He will cross the York River to Gloucester Point, break through the small force there, march north, and escape. His boats are loading in darkness when a sudden storm scatters them across the river. His last hope is gone. October 17th, 1781. A British drummer boy climbs the parapet. He beats a parley. An officer waves a white cloth. The guns stop. The silence after 8 years of war is extraordinary. 2 days of negotiation. Then the terms. On October 19th, Cornwallis's army marches out to lay down its arms. 8,000 men, drums muffled, flags furled. The band, by tradition, though the account cannot be verified, plays a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Cornwallis claims illness. He sends a subordinate, General O'Hara, to surrender in his place. O'Hara tries to hand his sword to Rochambeau, preferring to surrender to a fellow European rather than to rebels. Rochambeau directs him to Washington. Washington, with immaculate dignity, directs him to his own deputy, General Lincoln. Even in the act of surrender, the British cannot fully accept what has happened. They cannot accept who has beaten them. But the sword is delivered. The war is over. In London, news of Yorktown arrives in November. Prime Minister Lord North, by one account, staggers and cries, "Oh God, it is all over." Parliament, which has been fracturing over the war's cost and moral justification for years, finally loses its majority for continuing. North's government falls. A new ministry comes to power with one objective: end the war. Britain still has troops, still has ships. The war could have continued, in theory, but political will is the one resource you cannot requisition, and Britain's is gone. The Treaty of Paris is signed September 3rd, 1783. Britain recognizes the United States. It cedes all territory east of the Mississippi, a concession far more generous than the Americans had dared to expect, driven partly by Britain's desire to split the American diplomats from their French and Spanish allies. The Loyalists are abandoned. Tens of thousands leave, to Canada, to the Caribbean, to Britain, their homes confiscated, their loyalty branded as treason by the country that had asked for it. The enslaved people who had escaped to fight for British promises of freedom face outcomes that vary from country to country and case to case. But the promise, in most places, does not hold. For native nations, the treaty cedes their lands without consulting them. The nations that allied with Britain to stop American expansion find themselves abandoned to an expanding republic with no treaty obligations to honor. The Revolution's promise of liberty, soaring, universal, historic, falls unevenly. Some it frees, some it leaves behind, some it actively harms. This is the Revolution's open wound, and it does not heal. But the war's end is not the story's end. The United States now has to answer the question the fighting had deferred. How do you actually govern 13 separate, proud, argumentative political entities that share nothing except the fact that they no longer want to be British? The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at national government, are a document built on fear of power. Congress cannot tax, cannot enforce its own laws, cannot regulate trade between states. It is a government by permission, and the states are not always inclined to give it. By 1786, the Republic is in crisis of its own making. War debts are unpaid. Inflation is destroying ordinary lives. In Massachusetts, farmers who fought in the Revolution are losing their farms to debt collectors protected by the very courts they thought they had fought to control. Daniel Shays, a Continental Army veteran, leads an armed uprising. It is suppressed. But the message is unmistakable. The new nation cannot govern itself. In 1787, 55 men gather in Philadelphia, nominally to revise the Articles. They quickly decide to throw them out entirely. What emerges, after months of argument, compromise, and genuine political genius, is the Constitution of the United States. It is not a perfect document. It contains slavery in its architecture, in the 3/5 clause, in the fugitive slave provision, in the refusal to touch the question that everyone in that room knows is the question. They defer it to the future, to someone else. That deferral will cost 600,000 lives in a war fought 80 years later. But the Constitution also creates something genuinely new, a republic with separated powers, rule of law, and, the most radical element, a mechanism for the peaceful transfer of power. Government that derives its authority from the consent of the governed, not as philosophy, as a working system. In 1789, Washington is inaugurated as the first president. He serves 2 terms, and then, in the act that perhaps defines him more than any battle, he walks away. He could have stayed. Some wanted him to stay forever. Some wanted him to be a king. He goes home to Virginia. He tends his fields. Europe has no framework for this. Powerful men do not voluntarily give up power. It is not done. Washington does it. And in doing it, he establishes the precedent that makes everything the Revolution promised actually real. The reverberations do not stop at American borders. In France, the monarchy that funded the Revolution comes home to find its treasury empty and its subjects full of ideas. The French officers who served under Washington, Lafayette chief among them, return carrying Republican principles that mix dangerously with France's own fiscal crisis and political resentment. The French Revolution erupts in 1789. A king loses his head. Europe convulses. The irony is exact and devastating. Louis XVI bankrupted his kingdom to fund a Republican revolution. That revolution inspired his own people to end his reign and his life. Across Latin America, independence movements reshaping the entire Western Hemisphere draw explicit inspiration from what 13 colonies accomplished. Bolivar is reading Jefferson. San Martin is thinking about what endurance made possible. The chain of revolutions that restructures the Americas across the early 19th century begins here. Britain absorbs the loss and pivots. The empire does not shrink, it redirects. India becomes the center of what historians call the Second British Empire. Australia is colonized in 1788. The timing is not coincidental. Britain, having lost one world, begins building another. The lesson it half learns from America: settler colonies that govern themselves can be managed. Populations ruled purely by force cannot be held forever. It is a lesson Britain applies unevenly for the next century and a half. In America itself, the Revolution's longest shadow is the contradiction it refused to resolve. The founding generation knew it. They wrote it into the structure of the Constitution and called it compromise. The reckoning comes in 1861, at Fort Sumter, at Antietam, at Gettysburg. In the blood of 600,000 men finally fighting the battle the revolution refused to fight. Here is what the monuments obscure. The revolution was not inevitable, not a march of history toward justice, not a clean triumph of liberty over tyranny. It was contingent, fragile, deeply contested. It came within a decision or a storm or a missed dispatch of ending differently at dozens of points. If Howe had pursued Washington aggressively after Long Island, the Continental Army is destroyed before winter. If Burgoyne had respected the American wilderness, he reaches Albany and the revolution is split in two. If France does not enter after Saratoga, Congress runs out of money. If the storm does not scatter Cornwallis's boats at Yorktown, he might escape and fight another day. The revolution did not win because its cause was righteous. It won because of Washington's genius for survival, because of several catastrophic British strategic miscalculations, because a French king wanted revenge and was willing to pay for it, because the geography of a continent absorbed British strength like a sponge, and because enough Americans refused to stop fighting when every rational calculation said they should. Britain's army was superior in almost every engagement. It lost not because it lacked soldiers or commanders, but because it was fighting the wrong war. European military doctrine was designed to capture capitals, destroy organized armies, and compel surrender. America had no capital whose fall would end the war. It had no army whose destruction would end the resistance. It had, instead, an idea, imperfect, unevenly held, frequently betrayed, that a people had the right to determine their own political fate. You cannot defeat an idea by capturing a city. Britain learned this. Over 8 years. At extraordinary expense. And here is the deepest truth. The American Revolution was not, in the classic sense, a revolution at all. It did not overthrow a social order. It did not redistribute wealth or challenge the fundamental hierarchies of colonial society. The planters remained planters. The merchants remained merchants. The enslaved remained enslaved. What changed was who held sovereign authority, not how that authority was organized within society. The Declaration promised something larger, something it could not deliver in 1776 and would not deliver for generations. All men created equal, inalienable rights, the pursuit of happiness. But the promise, the act of stating it publicly, irreversibly, with full political force, was genuinely new and genuinely dangerous. To every system of power anywhere in the world that depended on people accepting their place without question. Which is why, when the guns fell silent at Yorktown, the world was not watching the end of a colonial rebellion. It was watching the beginning of something that is still, in the most important ways, unfinished. In the autumn of 1783, George Washington returns his commission to Congress. He resigns. He goes home to Mount Vernon. He is 51 years old. The man who could have been king, who was offered power that almost no man in his position in history would have refused, simply walks away. He will be called back. He will serve as president. He will set the precedents that define what the office means and what it cannot become. But in that moment of resignation, he does something that clarifies the entire revolution more completely than any battle or any declaration. He shows that the point was never the power. The point was the principle. Whether America has always lived up to that principle, that is the harder question. The one that every generation inherits from the one before it. The one that is never quite settled. The one that people are still arguing about, still fighting about right now. But the principle was stated, clearly, publicly, irreversibly. And once stated, once written down and paid for in blood, and argued over and fought for and survived, it could not be unstated. That is what the revolution was. Not a perfect achievement. Not a clean triumph. A statement made in extraordinary stubbornness, at catastrophic cost, by deeply imperfect men, about what human beings owe each other and what governments owe the people they govern. Imperfect, contested, incomplete, but said. And the world has been arguing about it ever since.